I'm Alex Traiman, and you're watching Jerusalem Minute, where we take you through the most important stories facing Jerusalem, Israel, and the Jewish people. This week, Israel's former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who was briefly Prime Minister for a year in between Netanyahu's tenures as Prime Minister, wrote in the Wall Street Journal that, quote, the U.S. and Israel need to take Iran on directly. He writes inside the Wall Street Journal that it is not enough for Israel specifically to deal with individual proxies like it's doing in Gaza with Hamas or in Lebanon with Hezbollah, or even to respond directly to the Houthis in Yemen, but rather that the war needs to be taken directly to the source, to the head of the terror octopus in the region, which is Iran. He writes in the Wall Street Journal that the Iranian regime is at the center of most of the Middle East problems and much of global terror. Yet inexplicably, almost nobody is touching it. For the past 45 years, the regime has been the source of endless war, terror, and suffering throughout the world. I've come to realize that enough is enough. The evil empire of Iran must be brought down. So Bennett not mincing words here about what he sees as being the overall source of all destabilization inside the Middle East, and yet his words seem to go directly at odds with what has been U.S. and Western policy toward the Middle East, which has been to bring Iran away from this designation as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism toward just another member of the community of nations, and even to allow it to go ahead and develop what are illicit nuclear weapons, and all the while funding them in the process, allowing them to do so. And that is why the Obama administration signed the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which was supposed to get Iran to pause their nuclear ambitions and in return receive significant funding for doing so. All throughout that process, continuing to develop illicit nuclear weapons, President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. But the Biden administration, the current Biden administration, has been trying to negotiate for years to get Iran to sign a new version of the JCPOA. And the Biden administration has released sanctions, provided some sanctions relief to Iran, giving them access to over $10 billion, and also negotiating a hostage release, some 5 hostages in return for $6 billion. So the United States and the Western international community providing Iran with the funds that they need in order to develop illicit nuclear weapons and also provide funding to their terror proxies across the region, including Hamas, including Hezbollah, including Yemen. And Naftali Bennett writing that if you want to stop the problems in the Middle East, that you have to stop the source of the problems himself, Iran. And Bennett makes a comparison. He writes, there is a new Cold War taking place in the Middle East. On one side, there is a corrupt, incompetent, and hollow empire, the Islamic Republic of Iran, similar to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. On the other side, there is a thriving, free, and strong democracy, Israel and its allies, reminiscent of the United States in the original Cold War. Now, I don't actually think this is a Cold War because this is a hot war. There's been numerous terror attacks against Israel by Iran and its proxies over the past several years. It's not only the threats of action. We're actually seeing now, especially since October 7th, how Iran has spilled over and brought Israel and the entire Middle East to the brunt of a major regional conflict, and potentially even towards something larger than it. So it's not necessarily here a Cold War, but I do see what Bennett is trying to do, trying to draw comparisons between Iran and Russia, because sympathies in the United States have turned against Russia, particularly since the war between Russia and Ukraine. So trying to draw some sort of parallels there between Russia in the 1980s and Iran today in order to get the international community to realize that it has made severe mistakes in its foreign policy and needs to actually now make amends and tackle the main source of instability in the region, which is Iran. Now, Bennett did something very controversial in this op-ed. He wrote, quote, I directed Israel's security forces to make Tehran pay for its decision to sponsor terror. Enough impunity. After Iran launched 2 failed UAV attacks on Israel in February 2022, Israel destroyed a UAV base on Iranian soil. In March 2022, Iran's terror unit attempted to kill Israeli tourists in Turkey and failed. Shortly thereafter, the commander of that very unit was assassinated in the center of Tehran. And so here you have a former prime minister basically acknowledging that he ordered attacks that previously Israel never took credit for. So Israel's been operating inside Iran, as everybody understands, from the Stuxnet virus to taking out nuclear scientists to the basically lifting of Iran's nuclear archives several years ago. And yet, many of the attacks that Israel's performed in Syria, in Iran, and elsewhere, it is done without taking responsibility for them. Naftali Bennett breaking protocol here and basically saying that he ordered the attacks to hit Iran on its territory. And this created waves inside Israel when he did it. It was a big shock. And in a press conference this past week, current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu slammed Bennett for his conduct in revealing classified information in a public article, and specifically doing so during wartime. Netanyahu said, quote, "This is extremely irresponsible. You don't do that, and he doesn't have the authority to do it. Only a sitting prime minister does, and I would do that sparingly as well." So Netanyahu taking issue with what Bennett rather said in his op-ed. He obviously wrote that without clearing it past military censors, without coordinating it with Netanyahu and the current government. And Bennett shot back at Netanyahu on Sunday stating, quote, "This is the time for unity, not politics." However, if you do read in a little bit into what Bennett was saying, he's basically trying to reposition himself as someone that understands the heart of the issue here in the region, which is Iran, and someone who has ordered strikes against Iran himself, potentially trying to reposition himself as a candidate to replace Netanyahu, as there continues to be pressure on Netanyahu inside Israel to resign as prime minister, both from before October 7th, when many people here in Israel were gathering in the streets calling for Netanyahu's resignation over judicial reforms, and just for being in office too long. Bennett did manage to replace him for a couple of minutes, even though he received a very small percentage of the popular vote in Israel during Israel's fourth election. His government didn't last. That crashed. Netanyahu won in the fifth election, and he has formed the current government in which is currently fighting this war. While there's not an election scheduled for several years from now, there could be pressure, tremendous domestic pressure after the war to try to push Netanyahu out of office. It's not clear inside Israel who might be a candidate that could succeed Netanyahu. Bennett thinking to himself, he did it once before, he could do it again. So it does seem here that Bennett is the one trying to play the politics, not Netanyahu, and potentially Bennett should have utilized more discretion, especially during wartime, and not trying to position himself as Netanyahu's successor amidst the battle.